Today it's our pleasure to have amongst us Dr. Dragomir Dimitrov. Dr. Dimitrov, born and brought up in Bulgaria, but his educational and academic journey spans across the globe. He completed his undergraduate studies in University of Sofia, Bulgaria, and graduate studies in University of Marburg, Germany. He pursued his PhD at the Department of Indology and Tibetology, University of Marburg, Germany. He was also engaged in advanced research. He was associated with the Arrowheaded Script project. He was local representative of the Nepalese German Manuscript Catalog and was acting director of Nepal Research Center in Kathmandu. Books like Legacy of the Jewel Mind, the Bhikshuki Manuscript of the Chandralankara, Marga Vibhaga, and several research articles are credited to him. Since 2008, he has been working as assistant professor at the Department of Indology and Tibetology in University of Marburg, Germany. Currently, he is affiliated to Department of Pali, Savitribai Phule, Pune University as Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow. Recently, some of us have heard him in his lecture on Saindhavi script in University of Pune. I believe it was just a glimpse then of his exhaustive study, and I'm sure even today he would enrich us through his lecture. I request him to begin this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction.
Can you bring that a little closer, maybe?
Yes. I would prefer to speak standing. So thanks a lot for this introduction. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be invited to Bori to share just some of my limited knowledge about the matters which I'm now going to talk, specifically about textual criticism. And I must confess that it's pretty tricky, and I made already experience with other students at other institutions here in Pune when they ask me to teach methodology and to teach how we do textual criticism. It's really very difficult to teach this because it cannot be taught, I think. I mean, it is something which can be learned, but it cannot be taught. It's a very paradoxical situation, and I must confess I have never been taught textual criticism. And you know, at least I have been dealing quite a lot with Buddhist texts, and the way we're proceeding with these Buddhist texts is very non-Buddhist. We do not try to avoid suffering. On the contrary, we have to suffer because no pain, no gain. We have to go through all these manuscripts and suffer days and nights and go through these sources and note down each and every difference and each and every error, and then try to solve the puzzle. And the problem is that usually the expectancy is that, okay, now we can talk about textual criticism and we may make some generalizations about textual criticism. And at least my experience is that it is impossible. Now we had a kind of textual criticism concerning Gargi Jyotisha texts. It is completely different from the situation which I'm now going to discuss. And partly the techniques are also different, and the reasoning may be also a bit different. So we cannot just say now we have to do textual criticism in this particular way, so you have to stick to this particular way. And that's why also I don't think that you can just take some textbook, read it and say, okay, now I did the course, now I'm now a textual critic and I can proceed with this. And there is another thing which should be considered in my view. Usually, people tend to talk about textual criticism, and they like talking about it, but these are mostly people who do not practice textual criticism. So there is a kind of again of a paradox. The most vociferous people about textual criticisms are those who do not do the practical work and who have enough time, because most textual critics do not have time to describe the way they're proceeding. It's a very plain explanation. So, in short, instead of theorizing a lot about textual criticism, my approach and the approach which my teacher had, Michael Hahn, in Marburg, was to just practice. We don't need to talk about it. We just grab a few manuscripts. If we're reading a particular text, we, of course, first of all, check whether we have primary sources, whether we have manuscripts. I can tell you, you know, my teacher, Michael Hahn, had the inclination to start his lectures with some autobiographical notes, which is not that well accepted in the West, I must tell you. And people do not regard it highly when people talk too much about themselves. So these autobiographical stories are not that well accepted. But and I was thinking, okay, it might be true, but in the end, I think it is not bad to speak about your own experiences, especially with people whom you don't know that much and they don't know you. And so we share our experiences, and this is in a way also instructive. Then you can understand better the psychology and the reasoning and the motives why we have proceeded in a way like this. So I remember that when we read once in Marburg the Katha Ratnakara by Hema Vijaya, it's a giant text. Well, the first thing was, of course, to collect the manuscripts from everywhere where it was possible. We have some in Berlin, and there, of course, several in India. And we had one Indian edition, we had another printed out edition. So we didn't satisfy ourselves with, we didn't content ourselves with just one published text and starting reading it. We actually started right away with textual criticism. And we didn't learn how to proceed. We just started straight away. I mean, you just take a dive, and then you start swimming as much as you can. If you can't swim that good, well, you have a friend of yours, your teacher, and they will support you a bit, and then you start swimming better and better. So that's the way we have been proceeding, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of pain. But I told you, there is much suffering in textual criticism. It's unavoidable. So you have to do it. Now, in the course of these autobiographical notes, I also remember when I went to Germany, to the city of Saarbrücken. It's in the western part of the country, as we know, in the west of India. I had a look at this book, The Language of the Earliest Buddhist Tradition. It's a collection of several articles, and one of them is by Gustav Roth. It's entitled Particular Features of the Language of the Arya Mahasamgika Lokottaravadins and Their Importance for Early Buddhist Tradition. It contains, in short, one description of a particular dialect, particular Middle Indian dialect, and then it has an edition of a text. And when I had a look at this text, I thought at that time, so 27 years ago, 22 years ago, I thought, oh, very nice text. Unfortunately, it's gone. It's already processed. It's dealt with. I cannot work on this. But I just remember this thought at the time. Oh, what a nice text, tricky text. It's not Sanskrit, it's not Pali. It's certainly something different. It's consistent. So it is a particular language, and it's a Dharmamapada text. So a kind of a Pali version of the Dharmamapada or something else. But I thought it's very interesting, but unfortunately it's already reserved. Somebody else has worked on this, so it's now history for me. I can just go once through it, and then that's it. Now, some 20 years later, I happened to deal with this text again, much more intensively. It was, for me, quite a surprise. And you can have a look at the book if you like. I would like first to explain how it happened that I came back to this old publication. and why I got so much involved now with this text, which, as you can see now in the title, I call Saindavi Dharmamapada. I'm sure that those who didn't attend my talk in the end of February, they'll be now wondering, what's this Saindavi Dharmamapada? I mean, Dharmamapada is okay, but Saindavi. So it is something which I assure you is new, because nobody until now has claimed anything like this, that we have Saindavi. And of course, I guess that some of you connect Saindavi with the Indus script and with the Indus Valley. And I don't know, how many people have attended the lecture? Can you please raise your hands, those who were at the lecture? Okay. If I could just give a very brief summary of this talk, so that we have the background, because this is important for the discussion which we're going to have afterwards, the pure textual criticism which we're going to practice afterwards. But I need to give you the background. Why Saindavi, and to what extent is this relevant to the text? And I can tell you right away, it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial to know this. So, just in a nutshell, I'll show you a few slides to give you the background, and then we'll proceed with reading some portions, and we're discussing some readings in the text. So, several years ago, I was working on the so-called Chandra Alamkara. It's a grammatical text by Sariputta. Sariputta, the famous Sinhalese scholar from the 12th century. And we have one very beautiful manuscript. It's a Codex Unicus, a unique manuscript. One portion of it is preserved in Cambridge, and another one is preserved in was preserved perhaps in Kathmandu. You can see, I'll pass the book. You can see the manuscript here. It's the facsimile edition. So in the course of this work, I get very much involved with the script of the manuscript, which you can see. And it was known at the time when I started working on this as Bhaikshuki. And this has been a topic which I have been dealing with for quite some time. So just to summarize, I came to the conclusion that what we have been calling Bhaikshuki is actually rather to be called Saindavi. Now, just to explain briefly how it comes, we have some information in Al-Biruni's Kitab al-Hind about 11 Indian scripts. You can see here a Russian brief stamp, post stamp with the image of Al-Biruni, and the first German translator, Karol Zachel, who edited and translated the text for the first time in the end of the 19th century, 1887. So in Al-Biruni's treatise, we have this short description of 11 Indian scripts, like Siddhamatrika, Nagara, Ardha Nagari, the way these are written in this book, Malvari, and then we have Saindava, which is in the Arabic text it's called Saindab, and then we have Bhaikshuka. So this script Bhaikshuka was became known to one British scholar, Cecil Bendel, who in 1884 made a trip to Kathmandu. He was still in his 20s. And there he was shown this manuscript, which a facsimile of which you see also in this green book. So this is the manuscript of the Chandra Alamkara. At the time when he visited Kathmandu, he was able to get one part of it I mean, most likely he was either presented with it or he bought one portion of it. But one portion of it remained in Kathmandu. So this is a facsimile of the manuscript, which is now preserved in Cambridge. The other one is meanwhile lost. We don't have access to the physical material. The interesting thing about this manuscript is the script. First of all, it is very uncommon. And at the time when Bendel discovered this manuscript, nobody else had a look at such a script. It's an Indian script, definitely, but it is completely unique. Of course, without much discussions, this guy started reading the text. He deciphered everything, and then he was able to say a few things about the contents. Just 2 weeks after the discovery in Kathmandu of this manuscript, he went to Calcutta on the way back to Britain. And in the Indian Museum, what is now in the Indian Museum, he spotted one image. And you can see on the base, we have 2 lines of inscriptions. And this inscription, he was also able to read in part. In any case, he was able to recognize the script. And it happened to be the same as the script of this absolutely unique manuscript which he just spotted 2 weeks earlier. So it was quite an amazing sequence of discoveries. I mean, it's unbelievable that just one person was able to discover 2 sources of a completely unknown, unique Indian script. Okay, now he gave a quick description of this. He recognized that the inscription contains the famous formula Ye Dharma, but he wasn't able to read it completely. This became possible a bit later when John Faithful Fleet made accessible to Bendel this image, which has on the plate, which is on the bottom, also an inscription, written in a very similar script, basically the same script, although it is executed a bit differently. But because this text is easier to read, then Bender was able to reconstruct also the inscription of the other image. And you can see now this is an enlargement of the Buddha image, the so-called Bihar 69, because the image was discovered in Bihar, 68. And you can see the 2 lines of the inscription. And then it became clear that the text reads something like this: Ye Dhamma Hetu Prabhava Te Sam Hetum Tathagato Avacha Te Sam Cha Yonirodu Evam Vadi Mahashamano. And you can see those who are versant in Bali, they will immediately spot some tiny, unexpected differences. For example, if you now just compare with the Pali text, now this is the Pali, so we have Hetu Prabhava, not Prabhava, and we have Aha instead of Avacha, and we have Tesam in Pali instead of Tesam. So in this other language, we have a dirgha, and here it is the short vowel. And then in Mahasamano, this other text had Mahashamano. So some quite interesting peculiarities, and these are not scribal mistakes, that's for sure. Now, it is absolutely consistent. So people were quite quick to understand that we're dealing here with another language or another dialect, and another Buddhist dialect, so used by Buddhists. So it was very interesting, of course. Okay, and then in the course of time, just within a few years, it became clear that we have several more inscriptions. Now, what I'm showing here on this slide are the epigraphic witnesses known to me at the time. They knew just a few. Nowadays, according to my research, we know about at least 15, which not all of them are accessible, but we have images of most of them. The most easily accessible are paradoxically those which are kept in the Indian Museum in the Museum für Asiatische Kunst in Berlin. The inscriptions which were discovered in India and they remain here are unfortunately very hard to trace. There is another one in Tibet which is absolutely inaccessible for those people who are not citizens of the People's Republic of China. And there is one which just recently was shown in from a private collection in Germany. All in all, we have 15 inscriptions. They contain about 50 lines of text. So it's a very scarce corpus of texts. And they mostly contain this Yet Dhamma formula and a few more names, but it's not much. What is interesting that all of these inscriptions, with just very few exceptions, were discovered in one particular region in today's Lakhisarai district, very near to Bihar Sharif, especially at the village of Uran. Only one inscription was discovered or traveled as far as Pagan in Burma. And there is one in Kara to the west. We have a concentration which led people to believe that this script was apparently used by a Buddhist community which was localized in this region, and they were using this particular dialect. Now, just 2 years after Zahau published his translation of Al-Biruni's Kitab al-Hind, of his book about India, he of course read it, and he spotted this description of the 11 Indian scripts, and there he read about Bhaikshuki, and Al-Biruni mentions that Bhaikshuki was apparently a script which was used in eastern India, in Purvadesha, in Udantapura. Now, at the time, they didn't know where Udantapura actually was. It wasn't discovered at the time. We now believe that it was at the site of today's Bihar Sharif. But at that time, it wasn't clear. And still, because of the concentration of these inscriptions in this Bihar Sharif area in Lakhisarai, and because Bendo also knew that several of them were indeed discovered there, he made this statement: should other specimens be found with these characteristics, one would be tempted to conjecture that it is none other than the Bhaikshuki lipi of Al-Biruni, the writing of Buddha used in Udumpur in the eastern country. So he was very careful, and now this is important. I mean, as a textual critic, one has to be very careful, not just to give a statement, a broad statement, and then let other people take it over. He was very careful. He said only, one would be tempted to conjecture. Now, despite being so careful, okay, at least Georg Bühler was also as careful as Bendo. He knew about the script which Bendo discovered, and he had the description provided by Bendo. He didn't introduce the name Bhaikshuki in his famous book on Indian paleography. He rather preferred to call it Pfeilspitzentypus in German, or the arrowhead alphabet, which also Bendo introduced as a name of this script. Then later, Dinesh Sirkar, in his publications, in which he treated a few more discoveries from Uran and the area, he then started using the term Bhaikshuki without any discussions. He just used the Bhaikshuki. This is the name of the script. So actually, as far as I know, it is Sirkar who introduced this name as if this is really the authentic name of the script. Then several other people also started using this name. Then my teacher Michael Hahn and my colleague Albrecht Hanisch also used this term, and along with arrowhead script. And then I myself, when I was working on this green book, I also wrote that it seems advisable to call the script Bhikshukhi, until we have some other news and some other ideas. My intention at the time was to avoid using such descriptive names as arrow-headed script or arrowhead script, because you can call the script in the same way, cuneiform script if you like, but it doesn't tell us much. So I liked the idea about calling the script Bhikshukhi, but with all the reservations. I mean, we have to be very careful that this might not be the original name of the script. Nonetheless, just recently I also contributed to the codification of this script in the Unicode standard set. So since the summer of 2016, this script, which we saw now in the manuscript and in the inscriptions, is now called officially in the Unicode standard. It is now Bhikshukhi. And I contributed myself to this. So, and there is no way back. Now the script is known to all computer experts and all who are dealing now with fonts and so on as Bhikshukhi. Okay. Now, what is Bhikshukhi? I have shown on this slide the derivation of the name. Of course, for any Paninian here, it's pretty obvious, and I'm sure that you can recite all the sutras. So we have from the word bhikshu, then we can construct a word with the suffix ka, so we have bhikshuka without any change of the meaning. Then we have bhikshuka with another suffix, so this is pertaining to the bhikshu, pertaining to the Buddhist monk, to the mendicant. And then we have the feminine form with the feminine suffix, so we have Bhikshukhi, and this refers to the word lipi, which of course in Sanskrit is a striling, feminine, so it is the Bhikshukhi lipi. So it is the script of pertaining to the Buddhists, pertaining to the monks. There is also something interesting here, which some Sanskritists will also perhaps feel. It is a kind of a pejorative name, actually, the Bhikshukhi. This little Bhikshukhi it's not the real Bhikshuka, the real Buddhist matter, but it seems to be a name which wasn't formed by the Buddhists themselves, but rather by outsiders who did not belong to the same community. I don't know what's your feeling about it. I cannot exclude this. Now, when Al-Biruni was reporting about the Indian scripts, one has to take into consideration that he's speaking also about some Eastern scripts, like Gaudi, which was probably a script which was current at the time in somewhere in Bengal. And he's talking about Purva Desha and Udantapur or something like this, and this was at least 1,500 kilometers away from the areas where he was able to go and to get information from first hand. So he was relying on secondary sources, and he even complains as a true scholar that he didn't have access to Buddhist materials, and he was forced to rely on secondary sources. And he admits this. It's a good example how people should admit whether they're using primary sources or secondary sources. So he was complaining and actually telling us frankly that his sources are not reliable. This is important to know with regard to the Bhikshukhi name and with regard to the connection of this Bhikshukhi with the script which we saw now in these inscriptions and in the manuscript. The problem is that Bhikshukhi is not precise enough. It's just a Buddhist script. And we have in the 10th century a number of other candidates, very good candidates, of particularly Buddhist scripts, which may have also been referred to as Bhikshukhi. So I'm showing on this slide two very nice calligraphically executed manuscripts, one of the Pancharaksha and the other one of the Maitreya Vyakarana. I dated recently, about 2 years ago, the Maitreya Vyakarana manuscript, which is kept nowadays at the Asiatic society in Bengal. I call this, meanwhile, the invincible citadel of Calcutta, because you can't get access to the materials there. It's very hard. I dated the manuscript in the year 975. It has a very interesting colophon with two figures. I claim now these are Latin numerals, and these help us to date the manuscript precisely in the reign of Gopala III, and the resulting year is 975. The script is a script which people usually refer to either as Kutila, and in Nepal it's very usual to call this Ranjana, which is a script which remained more or less without major modifications for a long time, and it's still used actually, a kind of a derivative of this script. So what I would like to say here is actually that the Bhikshukhi name could be related to this script as well, because these manuscripts were produced in the same area. We cannot know what these people who informed Al-Biruni about Bhikshukhi had in mind. Dinesh Sirkar took it for granted because of this very careful remark by Bendo that Bhikshukhi is referring to the script which Bendo discovered and which we have in these few inscriptions. But actually the story is not that straightforward, and it's not at all certain. Now, after I worked on the Chandralamkara manuscript, I happened to have a look at some Tibetan manuals on paleography, on Indian paleography. You know, the Tibetans quite unique. They have a predilection for systematization and for very systematized presentation of the matters which they are concerned with. And since, as you know, Tibetans have been translating together with Indian and Nepalese scholars huge masses of Buddhist literature, of course on the basis of manuscripts. They had to read these manuscripts, and for the purposes of reading these manuscripts they had to learn the scripts and the different scripts in which they are written, so they produced some manuals on paleography. And you can see on this slide a list of scripts which are exemplified in one of these manuals, and one of the scripts is called the Sindui Ige. Ige is a Tibetan word for lipi, for script, so it is the Sindhu lipi, what actually the Tibetans have written. Brian Houghton Hodgson, who stayed for a long time in Kathmandu and who got access to one Tibetan book or manuscript, he spotted this and he published this in the Asiatic Researches in 1827, if I'm not wrong. So Sindhu Ige, you can see now the Sindhu Ige here. This is a facsimile from this Tibetan manual. The first line with the bigger letters are the Indian characters, and then the second line contains the transliteration in Tibetan Uchen script, and then again the Indian script, and then again the Tibetan. And when Hodgson published this book, and Bendo reported about his incredible discoveries in Nepal and in Calcutta, in Vienna at the Oriental Congress, he was made aware by a colleague of his to the publication of Hodgson, and he had a look and he spotted there something very interesting, namely some characters which are extremely peculiar, unique, which he knew from his findings in these sources in Calcutta and in Kathmandu. Especially the sh is absolutely unique. I'm not aware of any other variety of Indian sh which is written with a dot in the middle. And strangely, we have this in this Sindhu Ige script table. So it was pretty obvious that the script which is exemplified by the Tibetans in this manual should be related to the script which Bendo discovered. And then I'm showing here another version or another edition of the same manual, in which the script is also called Sindhu Ige. We can skip now the stemma and the relation between these two books. There is a later text, again dealing with Indian and with the Tibetan scripts, in which our script is called this time not Sindhu Ige but Sindurai Ige. So we have two alternative names. An even later Tibetan manual executed by an expert calligraph, as you can see, is very beautiful. This book is now preserved in Potala in Lhasa. And there, again, the script is called Sindhu, and then we have the Tibetan equivalent of the same word, Gyatso Ige, which means, again, the Sindhu Lipi. So this was produced in the 17th century, in the latter half of the 17th century. And now here, I'm showing the relationship of these script tables, of this particular script. I'm dealing here only with the Sindhu Ige and with the Sindura Ige. As you can see, we have two versions of the early book which Hodgson published, and then Lokesh Chandra published another version of the same text, which happens to be older. And then we have on the other side, on the right side, at the end, the Sindura Ige. So Sindura Ige is the latest name. It's actually a rather modern creation. Now, when the Tibetans call the script Sindhu Ige, and we know that they call Magadha Ige, and they call it also Nagara Ige, and they say also Kashmira Ige, and we know Magadha Ige is Magadhi, and Kashmira Ige is Kashmiri, and Nagara Ige is Nagari, then it is quite logical. You can immediately reconstruct that Sindhu Ige is Saindavi. The interesting thing is now that Saindavi is indeed also mentioned by Al-Biruni. Whether it is just by chance or not, whether the Saindavi which is mentioned by Al-Biruni is referring to the same Saindavi which the Tibetans knew, we cannot find out. This is impossible because, unfortunately, Al-Biruni does not supply any script samples, so we cannot know. But we know for sure that the Tibetans knew a particular script by the name of Sindhu Lipi or Saindavi. And then we have several manuscripts which have been discovered after Bendo in the same script. So besides the Chandralamkara manuscript, we have one very interesting manuscript of Sarvarakshita's Manichura Jataka. This is a text which my colleague Albert Hanisch worked on, and it is already published, also with a facsimile. Then there is another very interesting text, Abhidharma Samuchaya Karika, which was discovered by Giuseppe Tucci in Tibet, to the south of Lhasa. So both manuscripts, the Manichura Jataka and the Abhidharma Samuchaya Karika, were discovered by Tucci, and quite incredibly, he was able to photograph the Manichura Jataka manuscript, and he took physically the other one. So it was just recently, about a year and a half, discovered in Rome in his private archive. Fortunately so, because this manuscript is now available, unlike the other one, which is now totally lost for us. We don't have any information where the manuscript is physically preserved. The Manichura Jataka manuscript, at least we have in a microfilm copy, so the material is and the contents are with us. And then in 2012, I was made aware of a Chinese documentary about manuscripts preserved in Lhasa, in Tibet. And in this Chinese documentary, they were showing various palm leaf manuscripts, and one of them happened to be in the same script. Unfortunately, the cameraman was moving and showing the manuscript very conveniently, so that it was easy to, with the Photoshop, to stitch all the individual images and to be able to read one complete folio site. And it was fairly easy to discover that this manuscript written in this, I will call now Saindavi script, contains a version of the Kevatta Sutta. And just a few days ago, actually, here in Pune, I was made aware, and a suspicion of mine was confirmed, that the manuscript is even bulkier and contains a few more sutras at least. And I saw just a tiny fragment, that big, of another sutra. But fortunately, it's also possible to identify the text because a name is appearing there, and we have Pali parallels. So I was able to identify immediately that it is the Kashyapa Sikha Nada Sutra. So another version of the well-known Pali Sutra. So we definitely have one part of a Dirgha Agama in this particular script. And then there is one more Mahakavya text, again available only in this tiny fragment. The manuscript is completely available in Lhasa, but we don't have access to. And then the fifth manuscript which I have mentioned here is actually a Proto-Bengali manuscript of Ratnamati Chandravyakana Panjika, which is written in an old version of the Bengali, or in a predecessor of the Bengali script, which I call Proto-Bengali. It is a very voluminous manuscript of more than 200 folios, and it has a double foliation. The leaves are numbered twice, once in this Proto-Bengali script, and then a second time in the same script which Bendo discovered. So currently we have more, we call these letter numerals, we have more letter numerals in this particular script than leaves. It's again a paradoxical situation, but it may well be that in Tibet still more manuscripts in the same script are preserved. Okay, now the question arises how the Tibetans knew about this script, and it is quite obvious that they have had direct access to these materials. At least we can judge this because we do have physically several manuscripts which are indeed kept there. They have been kept there for several centuries and in Tibetan monasteries. And in the Manipura Jataka manuscript, the first folio site of which you can see here, we also see some calligraphically written aksharas. And I consider this a testimony, an evidence that some Tibetan calligrapher or paleographer has been training there, and he has used this particular manuscript. So I suspect even that it may well be that exactly this manuscript served as the basis for the creation of the very first script table of the Sindhu Ige, of the Saindavi script, which we then see in these manuals on Indian and Tibetan paleography. Now this is an image of the Abhidharma Samuccaya Karika manuscript, which was recently discovered in Rome, in Italy. And you can see here I have highlighted Mahashamano. The Yedamma formula is quoted at the end of this manuscript, and we see the same linguistic features. This Abhidharma Samuccaya Karika was written by Samgatrata, who was, we don't know for sure whether he was a Samitiya Buddhist, but the text itself was certainly a Samitiya. It is specifically mentioned in the colophon that this Abhidharma Samuccaya Karika is a Samitiya text. So, in brief, this is the script which the Samitiya Buddhists used predominantly for writing their own texts. I'm here now only showing that we actually can't know now whether Bhikshukhi and Saindavi are referring to the same script. We can't know even whether Saindavi is referring to the same Saindavi script which we discussed right now. So it is possible, this is a possibility, we can only speculate. What is important for us is now that we have hard evidence that the Tibetans referred to this particular script as Saindavi. And the language in which these materials are written is peculiar. Until now, people have been describing this language as a mixture of Pali and Sanskrit. So it is neither Sanskrit, neither Pali, in a way. It has its own position between the two, in a way. We didn't have a name for this language until now, and now because we know that the script in which the Samhitas wrote their books was called definitely Saindavi or Sindulipi. And we also know from Tibetan sources that the Samhitas were most likely referred to as Saindavas or Sendavas. The Tibetans call them Sendapa. So these Samhita Buddhists who used the Saindavi script were referred to as Sendapas or Saindavas. For this reason, I now suggest, it seems pretty logical to me that we can introduce now the name Saindavi with regard to their language. So we don't need now to use any descriptive names, a mixture of Pali and Sanskrit or whatever, or Pali or hybrid Sanskrit or Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit doesn't apply here, but any kind of hybrid names we don't need. We have, fortunately, thanks to the Tibetans, evidence that speaks for the name Saindavi. So we have the Saindavi script used by the Saindavas, who are the Samhitas, who wrote their books in Saindavi. Okay, so this was, in a way, the background of the story. I just wanted to make clear why I'm using this name Saindavi. As I said, until now we didn't refer to this text, which we're now going to discuss, as Saindavi Dharmamapada. It was known under different names. I'll mention them in a few seconds. Let me first tell the story about this manuscript which you see now here. It is this Dharmamapada. It was discovered by Rahul Sankrityayana in 1934 during his third trip to Tibet in April and November 34. In the Ngor monastery in Tibet, he had access to quite a number of Indian manuscripts. And because, of course, it was impossible to copy these manuscripts, and he had a photographer with him, they photographed as much as possible. And because the materials were very limited, the photographic materials, the photographic plates, they had to photograph many folios at one time. So what they usually did, they took one manuscript, they turned all the leaves, or as many as possible, so all the rectosides, they pinned them to some wooden, to a wooden base, so that the leaves do not fly, and then they photographed them. And then they unpinned this, they turned the pages, and they took a second photograph. In this way, it was possible to photograph more material. Of course, then the image of each particular leaf is quite small, and it's not that easy to read this. This was the beginning of the studies of this particular Dharmamapada, this image. The images which Sankrityayana prepared, the photographs which he prepared, he brought to Patna, and they were kept at the institute there for a long time. I think Gustav Roth was at several decades also in the same area, and he had good contacts there, and he managed to procure a complete copy of Sankrityayana's collection of the photographs. He secured a complete copy, which was then brought to Göttingen in Germany. Since the materials were initially in Patna, and they may still be there, but they tend to be inaccessible, But because of Patna, people refer to this Dharmapada text as the Patna Dharmapada. So since then, and everywhere you read about the Patna Dharmapada. So whenever you read or hear something about the Patna Dharmapada, they actually mean the Saindavi Dharmapada. I'm now in the process of trying to introduce the Saindavi label, and I very much hope that I will succeed, because the Patna Dharmapada, there is no justification to call this Patna Dharmapada just because the images have been, or perhaps are still there, but they are not accessible. Jokingly, I have observed already that we may refer to the Dharmapada also as the Göttingen Dharmapada, because actually the image which you see here is from Göttingen. And it is the only one which is accessible. And it's accessible to everyone without any restrictions. The films have been already digitized, and you can use them. Now, this is the introduction to the whole story. Because it is a workshop, I don't intend now to give a lecture, and because people, especially here in Pune, keep always asking me, yes, how do you proceed? What's your methodology? And I cannot explain it. I have to show you. So I thought that it may be instructive and helpful, at least for some of you, to show you what I have done with this. I showed you the initial stage. I described you the background. I described you why I now refer to this as Saindavi, and I showed you the script. The script will play a big role now in our discussion later. But I would like also to show you how I practically proceed with this. And now, just as a tiny beginning, I will show you I'm not crazy, so to say, to work with this image. I mean, I have poor eyesight, and I don't want to lose it completely. So it's incredible. You cannot work with this. You know, our predecessors, who didn't have the luxury of using digital resources, they had a magnifying glass working with a photograph of this piece. And you can imagine how hard it is. And I know Gustav Roth had, I don't know, 8, 9 diopters. I mean, that big lenses. And it has been incredibly difficult for him to decipher all this. So what I first did, of course, is to take this image, and I excerpted each individual leaf so that it becomes much easier for me to work on it. So now this is a bit more comfortable. I will show you later the entire piece. Just in brief, what I'm doing, of course, I'm cutting the individual leaves. I'm preparing a normal PDF file, and then I bookmark everything. I add numbers, and then it is much easier. 1 second. So I have the individual leaves with the stanza numbers. Everything is bookmarked, and then I can very easily go around and check everything. This is just pure technical, actually self-evident work, but it has some practical advantages. When you're working on a text like this for a long time, for a year or 2 or 3, it's worth doing this for 1 day or 2, prepare the material appropriately, and then you're not losing any time more with searching in some JPEG images. Where was now this, and how, which leaf exactly, and so on. It's very tedious, and it's time consuming. So this, I mean, we have to facilitate our work, and this belongs to this. Now, What about the time now? I just want to have... how much time we have now? 35 minutes until the break. Okay, good. Then let me first tell you a few things about the discovery of this interesting manuscript. So it was discovered by Sankrityayana in our monastery in Tibet. Initially, Sankrityayana thought that this is a kind of a Sanskrit version of the Pali Dharmamapada. He just read the first stanza, which is, as you saw already in the Yadharma formula, it's a bit more Sanskritized than Pali, and this led him to believe that the Pali Dharmamapada, which he knew quite well because just a few years earlier he had translated it into Hindi, so he thought, aha, we have now here a Sanskrit version or Sanskritized version of the Dharmamapada. And he also was led to believe that the Sanskritized version of the Dharmamapada was translated by Vanaratna, this famous or Bengali scholar who also spent some time in Lanka, and he later also went to Tibet. And Sankrityayana was made aware of Vanaratna most likely by one of his assistants, and this was Gendun Chöpel, quite a remarkable Tibetan scholar and intellectual, who was very well versed in Tibetan historiographical literature, and in Tibet we have a very important biography of Vanaratna written by one of his Tibetan students. So at the time Gendun Chöpel was aware of Vanaratna. He knew that Vanaratna had been in Lanka and he was exposed to Pali literature. He knew that then Vanaratna was also active in Tibet. And then the Dharmamapada, I don't know whether you can see, but the manuscript which is photographed at the top happens to also contain the name Vanaratna. There is one Vanaratna Stotra, which was in the same bundle. So somehow they connected everything, related everything to Vanaratna, and at least at that initial stage, Sankrityayana and Gendun Chöpel thought that we have a Sanskritized version of the Dharmamapada, which was translated into Sanskrit by Vanaratna. This was the initial thinking. Gendun Chöpel had written extensively, and in one of his books he also mentions these manuscripts, and he's reporting in his book about fragments of the Dharmamapada, which is actually inaccurate because it is now quite clear that we have a complete manuscript of this text, so these are no fragments. We have the entire piece, and of course this is very important. In any case, they were quite aware already at the time of the discovery that it is a unique event in the history of Buddhist literature to have discovered this text. So it immediately drew their attention, partly because, of course, it is Dharmamapada, and they were concerned with this kind of literature. As I mentioned, Sankrityayana had earlier translated the Pali Dharmamapada in Hindi. Gendun Chöpel later, after the trip to Tibet with Sankrityayana, he went to Lanka, studied Pali, and translated the Pali Dharmamapada into Tibetan, and this was published then in the 40s in Sikkim. So these two gentlemen were really very interested in the text, but of course at the time they couldn't solve all the problems, and they couldn't know that it's even more interesting than they had supposed. Now, after the photographs, the negatives, were handed by Sankrityaina to the Bihar Research Society in Patna in 1964, that is almost 3 decades after the discovery, an Indian scholar by the name of N.S. Shukla. I'll be very grateful to any one of you who can tell me what is the first name of this N.S. Shukla. He utilized, as he says, a photostat copy of the manuscript based on these negatives and prepared the Editio Princeps, so the very first edition. So basically what he had at the time is this image and one more image with the verso side of the same leaves. He first submitted the edition in the form of a dissertation at the University of Delhi. In 1964, his dissertation, I guess a corrected version of it, was published in 1979 when he was already a professor of Indian studies at the University of Tehran in Iran. And the book is published under the title The Buddhist Hybrid Sanskrit Dharmamapada. I can show you one image of this edition. So you can see here the cover, the title page of this edition. This is the Editio Princeps, the first edition, done by Shukla, published in 1979 on the basis of his PhD work prepared in 1964. Considering the extremely unfavorable circumstance that he had to work with these incredible images, and he had to decipher the manuscript, and what I'm showing you here is one of the very nicely legible leaves. Some of them are not legible, very blurred, and it's really very difficult to decipher. And when you take also into consideration that the images with which he has been working were quite small, it's quite incredible what he has achieved. So he managed to decipher large portions of the manuscript correctly, more or less, and that's why I say that we have to give him full credit. Which does not mean that we cannot criticize him, because the work is, in many other respects, very deficient. And it is basically marred by so many mistakes that the edition eventually proved unreliable. And that's the reason why after this Editio Princeps was published, several other scholars attempted to do the work one more time. And in 1980, so just 1 year after the publication of Shukla's book, the German scholar Gustav Roth, whom I already mentioned, he had access to the same photographic materials, and he published his own edition as a supplement to his article. Now, the edition which I mentioned is exactly in this book, published in 1980. It was published as a kind of appendix to his article on the language of the Mahasamgika Lokottaravadins. In continuation of this work, in 1986, Roth published one addenda et corrigenda to his edition. So in the meantime, he had some corrections and additions. And these he published in an article. which hardly anyone has taken into consideration. Now, I mention this because I will show you. Now, Shukla, when he published his book, has at the very last page errata, a list of corrections. After this edition appeared, no one seems to have paid attention to this last page. And now, because we're now talking about textual criticism and editorial work, I mean, it is quite normal to make mistakes. And it is also praiseworthy to correct one's own mistakes. What then later scholars and users of these publications are not allowed to do is to disregard these corrections, no matter where they have been printed. Now, in the case of Shukla's book, they're printed in the book itself. In the case of Roth's edition, they were published 6 years later in an article. And I'll speak now about 2 more editions. These editors of these later 2 editions have not paid any attention to the corrections. So when they spot a mistake in the edition by Shukla, they think, okay, Shukla has made a mistake. Well, Shukla may have corrected this mistake, but they don't pay attention to the correction. And they claim Shukla has made a mistake. Yeah? And this is poor. This is absolutely poor. This shouldn't happen. So please, in short, just pay attention to the errata, to the corrigenda. You can see actually by chance the corrigenda to my green book, which I have to stick on this. This is actually the first thing which any user of a particular book should do, to check is there any corrigenda to the book. If yes, then you have to write down the notes in the book itself, because otherwise you'll forget about it. Yeah? I mean, these are just practical aspects. Of course, it's quite self-evident, but even great scholars, and I'm going to talk about two quite magnificent scholars, nonetheless, they have disregarded these simple matters. And it is not fair, because these people have done great efforts to do their job as good as possible. Now, what Roth has achieved in this publication, which we have here, is to present an improved version of the text. Apart from allowing some printing mistakes to slip into his text, however, Roth occasionally misread or misrepresented the text as handed down in the manuscript. Sometimes even at places where Shukla has read it correctly. And for this reason, Norman has once observed that the 2 editions by Shukla and by Roth, although based upon the same unique manuscript, show quite remarkable differences. For the most part, this is due to the difficulty of reading the photographs, but in some cases, the editions must have been misprinted. So he quite quickly established that even though we have 2 editions, now we have kind of a chaos, and we don't know which is true. Is now Shukla's reading correct or Roth's edition? As I already mentioned, in some cases, actually, Roth has misread the manuscript, which has been properly read by Shukla. Apart from this, we have mistakes on both sides. Now, because Norman was not happy with the situation, I guess, but I'm not sure, he may have proposed to Margaret Cohn. I'm sure the Pali specialists here know Margaret Cohn, the author of the Dictionary of Pali, the 2 volumes which have already appeared. So Margaret Cohn prepared, within her PhD studies, a new edition of the so-called Patna Dharmamapada. She submitted this work to the University of Cambridge in September 1986. These are 2 volumes. printed with a typewriter at the time. We didn't have computers at the time. You know pretty well what it is to print a book with a typewriter. I think most of you don't know this experience when you have to retype a page several times until you get it right. These are two voluminous volumes, and she edited the text one more time, so this is a third edition of the text, and supplied it also with an English translation and the philological commentary of very many different problematic passages and words. Now, based on this dissertation, which, as I said, was submitted in 1986, Cohn published only the text, so the edition only of the text, without the translation, without the philological notes, in the Journal of the Pali Text Society in 1989. So we have the third edition, which is currently available and easily available, unlike the dissertation, which is not that easy for you to get access to because the copy is just in Cambridge. What is easily available is the third edition on the pages of the Journal of the Pali Text Society, published in 1989, the third edition of the so-called Patna Dharmamapada. According to Cohn's short introduction there, she has recorded, I quote, all occasions where Roth and or Shukla differ from her reading, and she has presented the text, I quote again, without any editorial work of correcting or making consistent and supplying missing words or syllables in square brackets, only if we can be certain of what they must have been. So she has had a conservative approach with as much as possible avoiding any editorial work. Her aim was to reproduce what we saw on this image. That's what she is claiming, or she is promising us. Now, despite this conservative approach, which could certainly be helpful if unwaveringly carried out, Cohn's text does not properly mirror the manuscript which she has consulted by using a duplicate of Sankrityaya's photographs kept in Göttingen. Cohn used basically the same images. In a number of cases, Cohn has either ignored or misread the more or less clear evidence of the manuscript. Besides this, even though she has indeed noted most of the deviations in Shukla's and Roth's editions, some readings have either been overlooked or they are not reported accurately enough. Besides this, she has completely disregarded the corrections by Shukla and by Roth. So, even the places where she claims that Roth has published the text wrongly, actually we have a correction by Roth himself where the things are put straight. But this is disregarded in this third edition. So I came to the conclusion that Cohn's text neither does full justice to the Indian scribe's dictum yatha drishtam tatha likitam, nor absolves us from the task of checking the early editions. So, what's the point of doing all this, actually? Once we have the editio principis, okay, it's difficult. Then a second scholar comes and he, of course, tries to improve this. In that situation, we may hope that now the problem has been solved and perhaps we don't need a third edition. But as I mentioned, we have established actually, again, the situation is not satisfactory, so we need now a third edition. Now, I told you we have the third edition, and there we have, again, quite a lot of problems. Either misread manuscript or not fully taken into consideration what the early editors have done, overlooked, and so on. So we have already 3 editions which are not satisfactory. Which is a good reminder that the fact that we have a particular edition of some text does not mean that we should say, okay, good, this is done, as I thought at the time, and I should work on something else. No, it doesn't mean necessarily like this. I can just insert one more typographical note here. When I went to Marburg in 1995, my teachers proposed to me, Michael Hahn, to work on the Kava Adarsha, and he told me, okay, now you can produce a new edition of the Kava Adarsha. And I was terrified. At that time, I had courses with an overview of Indian literature, and I knew about Alankara Shastra a bit, and I knew that, well, Kava Adarsha is the most well-read text, one of the most important Alankara Shastra texts, and there are so many editions. I mean, this is completely silly. I mean, to produce one more edition, why? There's nothing new to say. It's impossible. And later I counted how many editions we had. So in 1997, I was aware of more than 40 editions of the Kava Adarsha. And I can tell you none of them, I swear, none of them is text critical in the proper sense of the word. So I produced a text critical edition within 2 years of the first chapter, Pratama Paricheda. And later I produced another text critical edition of the third chapter, including commentaries. But what I just mean to say is the fact that the text has been edited even 40 times, it doesn't mean that you should not again struggle with the same text. If you have the right sources and the proper techniques. If you have them, you may achieve some better results than the previous scholars. And the aim of our work is basically to make it easier for future generations. So what I have prepared in the case of the Kava Adarsha, it should not be necessary anymore for anyone else to deal with the same materials. That was my mission. I provided all the information which is necessary, even in some cases some facsimiles, even a diplomatic transcript, very detailed lists of variants and so on, with the aim that I should absolve you from the need to check again the same sources and wasting your time with the same matter. And I wasted already 2 years with this, or 4 years. So nobody else should need to do the same. You can spend your time with other texts, but not with the same one. If this is done properly, then it will be like this. If it is not done like this, then we have to produce one more edition and one more edition. And that's what has happened now in the case of the Dharmamapada. Now, unlike the Kava Adarsha, the Dharmamapada is of course a more complex matter because of the poor images and because of the peculiar language, because it is neither Sanskrit nor Pali, so it is something else. So we have linguistic matters, linguistic issues, apart from the paleography. Unfortunately, in this case, at least in the 3 editions which I have now already mentioned, we have serious paleographic problems, which these editors were not always able to solve. Not only because the images are not always legible enough, but also because of poor judgment, quite frankly. So, 1 year later, after Kohn's edition appeared, the Japanese scholar Kogen Mitsuno published his own edition. So we have now number 4. He most likely didn't have the chance to take into account what Kohn had done, but he had Shukla's edition. Already in the 1980s, Mitsuno had studied the grammar of what he says the Sanskrit Dharmamapada. So in his view, this was the Sanskrit Dharmamapada. That's the way he's referring to in Japanese. So at that time, in his Japanese publications, he also introduced the abbreviation SDHP for Sanskrit Dharmamapada. I'm very happy because I also now introduce the same abbreviation, but for Saindevi Dharmamapada. So he, at the time, used Shukla's edition and Roth's edition. He doesn't seem to have known about Kohn's efforts. In many cases, the Japanese edition does improve the text of the first 2 editions, but it also suffers from its own deficiencies. And the major drawback of Mitsuno's text is that it preserves some of the old readings which Shukla introduced and which then Roth had corrected. Exactly like Kohn, he has also disregarded the corrigendas of lists of Roth and Shukla, And then wherever he spotted mistakes, and there are of course quite many, he introduced conjectures. So he introduced his own corrections without any base, or without any evident base. Although we can say in most cases he was influenced by the Pali text, because there are quite a lot of similarities. So wherever he spotted a problem, he tended to correct the text in line with the Pali version. Besides this, and this is quite important now, he normalized, he standardized the orthography of the text. So in short, none of these 4 editions by Shukla, Roth, Kohn and Mitsuno can be considered to deliver what Naumann wanted to have, the definitive edition, which is the prerequisite for making substantial progress in the analysis of forms and categorization of dialect features exhibited in this codex. Now the matter is very important. We have a unique manuscript of a text in a unique language. In order to make proper judgment about the linguistic features of the text, you obviously need a good textual basis. This means you have to have deciphered the text properly, otherwise you can arrive at quite misleading conclusions about the linguistic features of the language. And this concerns even orthography. If somebody like Mitsuno has standardized the orthography, which is fine in many cases, but not in this particular specific case, because we do have to pay attention, a closer attention to the orthography. And later I'll show you some very crucial features which are based exactly on the orthography. Now, we can say that we have even a 5th edition, because in 2007, Ananda Jyoti Bhikkhu prepared a new publication, which is based on Koh's edition. I mean, Bhikkhu didn't work with the manuscript. He basically took over the text from Kohn, and he analyzed the text metrically. He supplied some useful notes, but he didn't practice proper textual criticism. Nonetheless, we can say this is now a 5th edition. Now, if you're searching just for the Patna Dharmapada, the so-called Patna Dharmapada, you may stumble upon this edition, which is available online. So, the literature on the so-called Patna Dharmapada, and particularly the presence of these 4 or 5 editions published so far, seems to suggest that it may never be possible to prepare a definitive text on the basis of the available unique manuscript. After I started working on this, I started to believe that nonetheless, if we apply proper philological methods, we may at least achieve some better results. And this has now something to do also with the evaluation of the text and of its school affiliation. Because we know that it is not the Pali Dharmapada, and several other Dharmapadas are known to exist, and they are related to particular Buddhist schools. These can be excluded. People have been trying to link this unique Dharmapada with another Buddhist school. You know that first the Pali Dharmapada, or the Pali Dhammapada, was published in 1855 by Figo Fausbøl. This is actually the first published Pali text, 1855. Then in 1962, John Brough published the so-called Gandhari Dharmapada. It's an exemplary work of scholarship. I recommend it to anyone interested in textual criticism and in philological work to have a close look at this edition. It is remarkable. It is a text, a Dharmamapada version, which is associated with the Dharmaguptakas, or perhaps the Akashyapiyas, but I think the prevalent view is now that it is the Dharmamapada of the Dharmaguptakas. It's a text which is, so to say, geographically positioned in the northwest, in today's Pakistan, we can say Afghanistan. Now, besides this, we have a portion of the Dharmamapada in the Mahavastu, which is a text of the Mahasamgikas, of the Mahasamgika Lokottaravadins. And then besides this, we have the Udana Varga, which is linked with the Mula Sarvastivadins, or with the Sarvastivadins. There are several versions of this. So all these schools can be excluded. They cannot be connected with this text. Still, in the early stages of the exploration of this text, Gustav Roth was inclined to connect this text and to relate it to the Mahasamgikas. That's why he published the text, his edition, as an appendix to his analysis of their language. Other scholars didn't accept this, and I think rightly so. And then, a few years after Roth's publication appeared, Oskar von Hinüber rightly said that even a very superficial glance at the language of the Patna Dharmamapada reveals features alien to the known Mahasamgika tradition. So he rejected this view. And he basically concluded that it is an example of a canon of an unknown affiliation and with a new variety of Buddhist Sanskrit. So he was quite careful to conclude that, I'm sorry, we cannot associate this text with any particular Buddhist school. We don't have enough ground, enough arguments. Now, in the course of this time, especially Japanese scholars have been studying some Chinese translations of Buddhist literature, and mainly Namikawa and Mitsuno became aware of Chinese texts which were obviously based not on Sanskrit works, and they were not based on Pali works, but they were mixed. They were based on a kind of mixed, on texts which have a kind of linguistic mixture. This they could conclude on the basis of some names which didn't correspond exactly to Sanskrit and which didn't fit in the Pali pattern. So they already had at that time suspicion that we have several, at least one or perhaps even more dialects, Indian dialects, which are neither Sanskrit nor Pali, but which were known to the Chinese early translators. And then when Namikawa had to look at the inscriptions, or at some of the inscriptions which I mentioned earlier, he noticed this particular dialect, and he suggested that some of these Chinese translations might be based on texts written in the same dialect in which the inscriptions are written. So he was one of the first to make this link between the epigraphic evidence, which I showed you, and this strange language about which he could make some conclusions on the basis of the Chinese translation. And then, applying the method of exclusion, Namikawa was tempted to suggest that the Samhita school was the most plausible candidate for the role of transmitter of the Patna Dharmamapada. So Namikawa, and then later also Mitsuno, suggested that we should associate the Patna Dharmamapada with the Samhitiyas. Later in 1997, Skilling, in one very important article on the school affiliation of the Patna Dharmamapada, which was published in the Journal of the Pali Society, also developed this idea, and he also came to the conclusion that this text might be related to the Sammitiyas. In other words, it might be the canonical Dharmapada of the Sammitiyas. Now, all these were just probabilities. The idea thought that the text is to be connected with the Mahasamgikas is certainly wrong, and this was seen already several decades ago. The idea about the Sammitya affiliation of the so-called Patna Dharmapada was something which looked quite probable, but it was impossible to prove it. We didn't have any real proofs. Is it time? Okay, good. That's a good place to make a break. Afterwards, we will say a few more words about the Sammitya affiliation, and then we can start discussing some interesting variants. And yes, sure. You can interrupt me anytime, so don't be shy. But let's first have a cup of tea, and afterwards. Okay.